The early dreadnought era is a fascinating time in naval history, a time of great change as navies across the world scrambled to adapt. Dreadnought herself had made whole fleets obsolescent, and because of that, all the major powers tried to build counters, and then build counters to the counters, resulting in, among other things, the South American and Anglo-German naval arms races. Ships were built, then almost immediately succeeded by improved designs, with all of this taking place over what amounted to a decade. Because of this, a lot of the pioneering ships are often forgotten. So, for today's video, we'll be going back to that interesting transition period, with the topic for today being USS North Dakota, one that's often forgotten, even by this standard, for being right in the middle of the pack, and unlike her successor Utah, not surviving to the Second World War. In fact, when you think of a battleship named Dakota, you probably think of one of the two South Dakotas, the unfinished Dreadnought or Battleship X herself. Let's change that today, starting with North Dakota's design, which was, in many respects, a pioneering step in American design. So let's set the stage. When the United States entered the Dreadnought era, it was with South Carolina, a ship designed and built under severe tonnage restrictions, not from treaties, but from what Congress was willing to spend. A ship with super-firing turrets, the layout that would become standard, yet also a ship with an underpowered propulsion system, slower than many of her contemporaries as a direct result, and quite small in general. The Navy wasn't blind to those problems, of course, and when Dreadnought was revealed, designers set about building a counter. The result would be the Delaware class, a pair of ships freed from most tonnage restrictions. Among other things, these would be far larger ships compared to their predecessor, where South Carolina was closer to a pre-Dreadnought in scale. North Dakota would be larger in displacement than Dreadnought. The battleship displaced 20,380 tons at the standard loading, with this going up to 22,400 when fully loaded. For comparison, South Carolina was around 17,600 tons, and Dreadnought got to 20,700. That difference in size continued to the overall hull. North Dakota was 518 feet long, 158 meters, with a beam of 85 feet, 26 meters. The relatively small South Carolina was 452 feet long and had a beam of 80 feet, or 138 meters long, with a 24-meter beam. For her part, Dreadnought would actually be the longest of the three at 527 feet, 160 meters. Her beam, however, was slightly smaller than North Dakota, 82 feet or 25 meters. Now, with this in mind, what did North Dakota bring to the table for that increase in size? Well, the answer is simple: firepower. North Dakota carried 10 12-inch, 305mm guns in 5 twin turrets, the same number and caliber as Dreadnought, and an extra pair of guns over South Carolina, which carried 8. Where North Dakota differed, however, was in layout. Unlike Dreadnought, all of her weapons were carried on the center line. A super-firing pair on the bow, with a third turret behind the second funnel. As for the final two, those were in an interesting position, back to back on the stern, Not the most efficient use of space, but simpler than a super-firing pair. Regardless, that meant North Dakota could bring all 10 guns to bear on either broadside. Dreadnought was limited to 8, something that applied to any ship equipped with wing turrets. Not a flaw, simply a concession to the design choice. In any event, to back up those big guns, North Dakota carried a further 14 5-inch guns in single casement mountings, with those supported in turn by the usual submerged torpedo tubes. 2 in this case, with 1 on either broadside. That wraps up the weaponry, so what about the armor? Well, that came out to 9 to 11 inches, 229 to 279 millimeters on the main belt. As North Dakota predates the all-or-nothing armor scheme, she also had lighter armor spread over the ship. The casement armor, for example, varied from 8 to 10 inches, 203 to 254 millimeters, while deck armor for its part was pretty standard for the time, 2 inches or 51 millimeters. Which wraps up the armor, so let's finish this section off with the speed, where North Dakota differs from her sister Delaware. You see, as an experiment, the Navy used 2 different power plants when building these ships. Both had the same 14 boilers and the same 25,000 shaft horsepower through 2 shafts. However, Delaware used old-school triple expansion engines. North Dakota, by contrast, used new steam turbines. It's a similar situation to Nevada and Oklahoma, which similarly adopted turbines and reciprocating engines respectively. Suffice it to say, North Dakota paved the way forward. Turbines, as they came into their own, were the way of the future. That said, as we come to the end of the design section, we can move into what that meant in service. If you're wondering why this section was so long, it's simple really. North Dakota would have a generally pretty quiet service life, with this story beginning in the Four Rivers Shipyard in Quincy, Massachusetts, when North Dakota was laid down on December 16, 1907. The ship would be launched on November 10, 1908, and commissioned on April 11th of 1910. A bit over 2 years to complete, which is in keeping with other dreadnoughts of her time. On the other hand, her entry to service wouldn't be quite so simple, or standard. Shortly after she joined the fleet in September 1910, the ship suffered an explosion. On September 8, 1910, the battleship was testing oil as fuel, when an accidental explosion aboard North Dakota killed 3 men and set a fire in the engine room. Burning oil floated above a boiler, while flames and smoke filled the area. This could have gone very badly had the fire spread. However, 6 brave sailors, August Holtz, Patrick Reed, Thomas Stanton, Carl Westa, Charles Roberts, and Harry Lipscomb, waded into the engine room. Despite the flooding, the fire, and the smoke, these men shut off the boiler fires. In so doing, they helped prevent a potentially catastrophic boiler explosion, in addition to finding the bodies of the 3 lost sailors. For this, likely saving the ship, the 6 men were each awarded the Medal of Honor, one of the highest proportions of Medal of Honor recipients per crew in the fleet, and certainly impressive for coming during peacetime. That said, once repairs were complete, things would quiet down. North Dakota would sail to Britain and France in November 1910. Then she would spend the next couple years, 1911 through 1913, on training duty. Nothing particularly noteworthy and perfectly average for a peacetime battleship, with one exception on New Year's Day of 1913. North Dakota would be part of the honor guard escorting a British armored cruiser, HMS Natal, carrying the remains of the United States ambassador to Britain. As an interesting note, and why I always maintain double check your sources, the Dictionary of American Naval Fighting Ships cites this as a Brazilian ship carrying the American ambassador to Brazil. Always, always, always double check your sources, being as HMS Natal got the nickname Seahorse for this particular duty. That aside, North Dakota would be back to training duty after this, at least until 1914. While the Great War broke out in Europe, North Dakota would be uninvolved. The United States was, at least at first, neutral, and preoccupied sending troops to occupy Veracruz in Mexico. That too. North Dakota would be anchored off that port on April 26, 1914, 5 days after the occupation had begun. The battleship would sail up and down the Gulf of Mexico, protecting American interests, with the ship only returning home on October 16, 1914, whereupon the ship would be put through the ringer. The Navy intensified its training program with an eye towards being ready should war come to the United States. This wasn't quite as obvious as it would be 20 years later with the Second World War, but nonetheless, it remained a good precaution, because that war would come on April 6, 1917, with North Dakota and Chesapeake Bay on yet more, gunnery in this case, training duty. If she were called to action, that would have been helpful. However, she was not. While Delaware would be sent to Britain, the same couldn't be said for North Dakota. She remained in home waters for the rest of the war. Not that Delaware got up too much beyond patrol duty, but at least she got to leave home. Then again, North Dakota, with her turbines, was more valuable at home, where she could be put to use training engineers for the rapidly expanding fleet, especially all those four-stacker destroyers. Something amusing when one takes into account the actual reason the ship remained home. Admiral Hugh Rodman refusing to take her because he felt that North Dakota's engines were not reliable enough. Those engines would actually be replaced in 1917 with newer model geared turbines, along with new fire control equipment, neither of which were put to use against the Central Powers, of course, but that is hardly unique. In any event, when the war concluded, North Dakota would be sent to Europe at last. On November 13, 1919, she carried the remains of the Italian ambassador back to Italy, after which she made a grand tour of Mediterranean ports: Athens, Constantinople, Valencia, and Gibraltar. When that was done, it was back home and back to training, something that continued into the 1920s, with the exception of one event in July 1921. North Dakota was one of the observation ships during the bombing trials that sank SMS Ostfriesland. After that, back to training, something that would be North Dakota's reason for existence soon enough. If you study naval history, you know what's coming. In 1922, the Washington Naval Treaty went into effect. Most of the old dreadnoughts, at least in the major navies, would be put to the scrapper's torch. North Dakota and Delaware would not escape this fate. Both were set to be replaced by the new Colorado and West Virginia. Delaware would be outright scrapped. North Dakota, on the other hand, was lucky enough to escape the torch. She was instead decommissioned on November 22, 1923. Instead of being scrapped, North Dakota was disarmed and converted into a radio-controlled target ship. In that role, she would serve out the remainder of the 1920s until being replaced by USS Utah in 1930. North Dakota would then be scrapped in 1931. A surprisingly long life, all things being equal. And her turbines would last even longer, being used as part of Nevada's modernization in the 1930s. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.